Thank you all for joining us today for this timely and widely discussed issue where we will talk about balancing campus safety and free speech while addressing anti-Semitism, extremism, and law enforcement challenges. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Baker. I am a senior research fellow at the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University. In recent years, university campuses across the country have become flashpoints for a host of pressing issues: free speech, student safety, political expression, and rising concerns around extremism and anti-Semitism. What once may have been confined to classroom debates or campus flyers now plays out in real time in protests, counter-protests, disciplinary hearings, and national headlines. As pro-Palestinian activism has surged, we've also seen the emergence on some campuses of groups linked to extremist ideologies, including organizations with open support for Hamas, a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization. These affiliations have added a new urgency to this debate, raising difficult questions about where advocacy ends and incitement begins, and what responsibilities universities and law enforcement have in responding. At the same time, Jewish student communities are reporting a disturbing rise in anti-Semitic incidents, creating a climate of fear and alienation that many institutions are struggling to address. Today's panel brings together professionals from law enforcement backgrounds, Jewish community organizations, and the legal field background, each bringing a distinct and critical perspective to this conversation. Together, we will explore how these sectors are navigating an increasingly complex campus climate. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our three speakers today who will assist us through today's very important discussion. First, I'd like to introduce you to Mark Henderson. Mark is the Regional Security Advisor for Rochester Regional Security Initiative at Secure Community Network. Mark has spent 34 years in law enforcement. 10 of those years was as the Chief of Police for the Brighton, New York Police Department. Mark has served on the New York State Law Enforcement Agency Accreditation Council and was nominated to be its chair upon retirement. Mark attended the FBI National Academy and the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Seminar. He has worked in the Jewish communal security since October 2019. Next, we have Carrie Reifel. She is the Director of Safety and Security for Hillel International. Carrie has over 25 years of experience in law enforcement, to include operational leadership roles in growing and developing multidisciplinary teams to combat violent crime. Carrie spent many years working in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit as a certified profiler. In this capacity, Carrie provided operational support and training to local, state, federal, and international law enforcement agencies. Most recently, Carrie provided behavioral-based threat assessments, risk mitigation, domestic and international counterterrorism, and targeted violence prevention across a wide range of targets and threats, including active shooters, stalking, workplace violence, ideological extremism, and persons of interest. Last but not least is Ariel Katz. She is the Assistant General Counsel at Hillel International. Since joining Hillel International a little over a year ago, she has counseled dozens of students, faculty, and Hillel staff on navigating Title VI matters. She frequently speaks and advises about both the intersection of Title VI and free speech and how to navigate and balance these both. We will have a Q&A session at the end of our discussion, but please feel free, if you think of any questions, to post them in the chat box during our panel conversation, and we'll get to those at the end. Okay, we're going to begin with Mark. Mark, first and foremost, thank you very much for your service to law enforcement. That's quite a dedication of time, and we appreciate that. As someone with a law enforcement background, Mark, your perspective of having been on the ground is vital here. So let's start with the broader picture.
Thank you,
How
Jenna.
ha Sure. Thank you for being here again, and your background is very impressive. So my first question to you, Mark, how has the increase in pro-Palestine protests over the past 2 years impacted campus security and law enforcement's approach to maintaining safety?
Thanks for the introduction. Nice to see everyone. Welcome. So I'm going to come at this from a perspective of former law enforcement. And I know many on this call may look at that and ask whether I'm a subject matter expert, a current subject matter expert. I will address this from my perspective in an interface with the different campuses that are in my area of responsibility. And Jennifer, exactly what you talked about, right? So the world changed for the Jewish community security world on October 7th, 2023. And after that, we started to see in the spring and fall of 2024 a rise in different activity, and in particular protest, counter protest, and in conflict. So um, I addressed a group of regional security advisors for college campuses, and then the New York State University campus security program with their sworn chiefs and commissioners, and we talked about this very topic, right? So acknowledging that the potential was very real for an escalation of protest and talking about responses to protest. Some of the larger sworn entities were able to have their protocols, procedures in place and have adequate staffing for response. Some of the problems came in with the smaller campuses that didn't have a workforce to prepare for protest. And some of them in my area of responsibility were the subject of protest. And so working through relationships with law enforcement, local and state, in the response to that event that was unfolding on campus, right? So some events started out as protest, escalated to building takeovers, encampments, and then the conversation was, what do we do with that, right? So, in preparing for the fall semester of 2025, having defined plans, identifying local sources and resources, it was key. But to answer your question, the escalation that was anticipated, and I know Carrie will go over some of that, it has come to fruition. And the preparation that happened in the area, I think, was something that has led to some successful outcomes.
Thank you very much for that. And obviously, law enforcement doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? Coordination is key, and it's important to collaborate with campus administrators, student groups, and external organizations like Hillel, which we'll talk about here more in addressing these issues. But building more on that, I imagine your teams often face very delicate decisions when responding to these protests. What can you talk a little bit about what challenges police faced in distinguishing between lawful protests and behavior that crosses the line into harassment or hate speech?
And this occurred very early as protests were just starting out, right? So Um, there's some protests that were planned, allow for some pre-planning and preparation, or some that are just pop-up protests. Early on, when it was a pop-up protest and flags and clothing and conversation started dialogue with students, we responded to campuses and said that they have to go away. We don't that protest wasn't sanctioned, that protest isn't allowed, and in the manner of the communication was deemed on one side to be hate speech. And through the process, a number of agencies, and in particular in our area, we worked with the Western District of New York, and there's a hate crimes prosecutor who basically told a group of leadership that hate speech is free speech, right? Action, violent action, and physical conflict is one thing. You can't come in and say you don't like the message. That's protected free speech. And after that conversation, after that focus, the response was to not talk about the subject matter, right? The flags, or the clothing, but to look at the behavior and try to keep counter protesters or and keeping students safe walking to and from classes, but trying to address the conflict that is generated with the diverse opinions or perception of what is being said.
Absolutely. And I know New York is a very busy area as well, in currently. Thank you very much. Mark, did you want to add anything to that before I go over to Carrie next?
No, I think it's good. Thank you.
Okay. So I would like to turn it over to Carrie. She's our representative, as I mentioned before, from Hillel. And thank you, Carrie, as well for your dedication and service to law enforcement. So, Carrie, your work puts you in direct contact with Jewish students and the broader campus community. How have Jewish students been affected by the rise in pro-Palestine protests and anti-Semitism on campus and especially in the most recent years?
Great question. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a really important topic, so I appreciate everyone's time. And that's a loaded question. Like I started in this position right after the attacks on October 7th. And so everything I see on college campuses has been post that. And I can tell you just in the year and a half, the trends have changed. They've gotten more intense. Even if incidents appear to be lower, or maybe you're not seeing it on the news as much, I can assure you it's happening. I cover technically over 850 campuses in 16 countries. So think about how big that reach is. So when I talk about activity on college campuses, just know that I'm talking from a very, very, large one, 1,000-foot view, so to speak, on what our students are experiencing. And I mean, it's pretty terrible in my opinion, just from the outside looking in, from talking to students. It started with the protests, obviously, and it grew. Like it became from generalized to more specific to this year now our Jewish students and organizations are being directly targeted, whereas a year ago that wasn't necessarily the case. And one thing that I really want to try to distinguish here is we have a lot of Jewish students that are pro-Palestine. And so there's a conflict in when this crosses over to the pro-Hamas and the rhetoric and the language that's being used during these protests, because our Jewish students that want to support, the pro-Palestine piece are caught, I think, in a really tough spot as well, because they can't, it's tough to be outwardly Jewish. And that's what I hear from these students everywhere. Like I stopped wearing my necklace, my Star of David, because I know now that I am being directly targeted. And so for our students to have to consciously think about how they present when going to class is really, really sad and disappointing. And we're trying to find ways to keep our Jewish students safe. But unfortunately, this year, in my opinion, even though, like I said, numbers may look lower, the direct targeting of our students in our Jewish, community, whether it's Hillel's, whether it's Chabad on campus, whether it's Greek life, it's just more direct targeted and more aggressive. And so the fear in our students is increasing, in my opinion.
Well, and you covered what I was going to ask you next, but just to be clear, if you can repeat that, what are you hearing most from these students? And you did say they're feeling increasingly unsafe on campus.
Yes. And, and every campus is different. And so I'm talking, in general terms, but like we were just at a Hillel International event about a month and a half ago called the Israel Summit. And it was Jewish students from all over the country came together. I think we had about 400 Jewish students from, all over the country. And I taught a class on safety and security. And one of the questions I was asked by one of our students was, how do I stay safe on campus without being paranoid? And so that should tell you the mindset that our students are in every day when they're going to class. She literally was like, I don't know how to be safe without being scared to death all the time. And so we're now finding ourselves trying to teach our students the best tools and the best way to be aware of their environment. And unfortunately, hey, if you're leaving Shabbat dinner, make sure you're walking with someone. Like it's things that our college students shouldn't have to worry about right now. They should be worried about, getting an education and having fun. And even our classroom environment, which is something we can talk about later, is another entity that is very, very concerning right now, where our students are feeling unsafe, even inside a classroom.
That's very sad to hear. And as a mother with kids that are going to go to college one day, I just can't imagine the environment right now. Um, so when students do encounter these anti-Semitic incidents, how can they go about reporting these incidents on campus? And can you tell us a little bit about what your agency does with this information that gets reported?
Yeah, absolutely. Every campus has its own internal reporting mechanism for incidents that take place. So what we created several years ago is a reporting system called Report Campus Hate. And this reporting mechanism, it's a really simple thing online. It's a form you fill out. You can just go to this website, fill it out. It can be anonymous. There you see it on the screen. When students fill that out, this reporting goes directly to Secure Community Network. We have a 24/7, I'll call it like an intel center, where we have analysts that work round the clock on managing all the intake and all the activity on different campuses that they're seeing. They also have a direct line to Homeland Security, the FBI. So any of those incidents that happen get immediately pushed out, depending on what the incident is. It gets pushed directly to the state and local law enforcement where that incident took place, as well as federal agencies, if it appears to be something that is, a more of a federal, needed response, so to speak. And then, of course, we share it with all of our Jewish organizations. There's a couple of us that are on that from Hillel International. So we see the reporting immediately and we can address it immediately. So it's a national reporting mechanism. We can also, with this, we track what the trends are showing us. So what's changing? You look at all the incidents from last year to this year and what's different, and it helps us inform law enforcement so that they can better prepare on college campuses for what we're seeing now and what we may potentially see in the future. So it's dual reporting when it comes to the campuses, because I know, like I said, every campus has their own internal system, but it's a way for us nationally to track incidents and make sure all of the proper law enforcement entities are informed and have all the information.
That's great. And I'm sure you all are busy, as like you said, 24/7 operations. So thank you for what y'all are doing. Um, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot and see what you think, if you can answer this. How effective do you think the current university policies are in protecting Jewish students that are targeted against harassment and anti-Semitism? And I know I'm putting you on the spot. So,
Definitely putting me on the spot.
yes.
It's a great question, and I think it's a question that everyone's asking, right? And I would say a year ago, I don't think our campus administrators, I don't think anyone was prepared for what was going to happen. Think back literally a year ago, what started, right? The encampments. That was it took off in just 1 week across the country, grew everywhere. And I don't think, schools were ready. Every campus organization or every college has a code of conduct that's already in existence. And I think that there was a concern on enforcing it, depending on the campus, depending on the university, for various reasons. But I think there were a lot of lessons learned last spring. And I do believe that campus administrators are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to protect students. And so I think a lot of changes have been made. And when I say changes, more of the green light to enforce what's already in existence. Some campuses, I do think, created some new codes of conduct, but ultimately, they're trying to address this. They're trying to get ahead of it and be prepared and have consequences. And the process takes a long time. From a law enforcement perspective, even on campuses when students are being suspended or student groups are getting expelled, depending on the behavior, it takes time. Same thing with the criminal system. If students are actually going to be arrested and charged with a hate crime, it takes time to get through the system. So I know that our students aren't seeing the results fast enough, but I know that the effort is there. It is happening. Could it be improved? Always. But it is, I think, a lot better this year than it was a year ago, but we have a long way to go as well.
That's great to hear. And I know I'm hearing that as well from some of our contacts that we have at universities, that they're seeing things being improved as well. So that's reassuring. And not to get into any of the politics, but I see things are changing as well with our administration on as far as new actions being taken. So reassuring to hear that. Thank you, Carrie. I'd like to shift now for the time being to some of the legal dimensions of this issue. And this is why we brought our Ariel, our legal expert, because she can bring some clarity and explain how universities can and how they should balance free speech with legal protections. So Ariel, thank you for being here again. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you, my first question that I have for you is, how do you distinguish between protected speech, such as protests or criticism of Israel, and unlawful anti-Semitic conduct or hate speech on campus?
Thanks for the question, and thank you for having me. And thanks to Mark and Carrie, and especially to Carrie. We're very lucky to have her at Hillel International. Yeah, so Mark sort of touched on this in his answer when he was talking about hate speech. Hate speech is generally protected speech. That doesn't mean that it's not hateful, and that doesn't mean that it's not having an impact on people. So I want to start with that. And I want to know, I know we're in a panel on the law and law enforcement, but I do want to note that if we're using the law as a barometer for what's ethical or moral or what's right, that's probably not the way to make policies on a campus, right? Things can be really hurtful that are still legal. So I want to note that first, and then I'll get into the legal piece of it. So again, hate speech is generally protected, but incitement to violence, for our purposes, there are two exceptions: incitement to violence and true threats. So I'll give some examples. If someone is saying women don't deserve to live, or Jews deserve the violence happening to them, that is likely hateful speech, right? It's hateful, it's hurtful to the people it's happening to, but it's likely also protected free speech. And so that's like important to note. It becomes, a true threat if someone says something like women, including Ariel Katz, don't deserve to live, right? I could perceive that as a threat. It could be, I could say they're singling me out. Usually what we're seeing on campuses, though, is not rising to the level of incitement to violence or true threats, right? People are saying things like Zionists are not welcome here, Zionists don't deserve to live, Zionists should be, ashamed to set foot on campus, things like that, that are clearly very hateful. And so the protection that comes in isn't necessarily free speech rights. We have to let those students say those things, but it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so Title VI is a piece of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that protects against discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The national origin piece is where Jews are protected, as well as, Israelis or anyone who has a connection to the land of Israel. And so the idea is that you can't create, this is overly simplifying it, but you have to ensure at a university or any place that receives federal funds, which all universities do, even private ones, you have to ensure that there's a non-hostile environment for the students there. And so you could argue that if people are on campus saying Zionists should not live, or, women should not be here, or no gay students allowed, that is creating a hostile environment for those groups of people. So the speech might be protected still. The university cannot stop the person from making that speech, right? That's what it means to have free speech. That doesn't mean that there can't be other steps the university can take, like issuing statements condemning that type of speech, issuing statements saying we support our Zionist students here, we support our Jewish students, they belong here. Making sure they have time, place, and manner regulations for the speech that's occurring. You can't at 3 a.m. go blasting that kind of speech on the quad. All schools have codes of conduct, and as Carrie noted, they're doing a better job enforcing them right now. And a lot of schools are doing a better job also like implementing and revising their codes of conduct. So that's something that I want to know. And then I want to go to the first part of your question where you talked about criticism of the state of Israel versus sort of, speech that might veer toward more Title VI violations. Of course, people can criticize the state of Israel. I'll note, if anyone's following the Israeli news right now, there's tons of protests for the past year and a half. There's hundreds of thousands even of Israelis protesting the current government. So that's something that could happen on college campuses too. What's usually happening, though, is the speech that I noted, where people are saying Zionists are not welcome here. They're holding up signs that have a Star of David in a trash can. They're doing things that, of course, cross the line from criticizing a state government and basically saying they want that whole country to be wiped off the map. And so that veers toward, again, harassing behavior. So something to sort of keep in mind as you're thinking about the tension there.
Appreciate explaining that. That's very, very helpful. And leaving that for the time being and talking about another aspect of this, of course, here at the program on extremism, we research a lot of different student groups and extremist groups. Not that we're going to go into that in this panel, but Ariel, can you address there's the growing concern of these extremist elements that are embedding themselves into these student movements? Are you seeing that these extremist groups are using student activism as a cover for a more dangerous or unlawful activity? And can you address how legal mechanisms could address this threat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was a lawsuit brought, I believe, sometime last week, late March, by the National Jewish Advocacy Center, the Schoen Law Group, Greenberg Traurig, which is a very large law firm, and Holtzman Vogel law firm, on behalf of families of victims of the October 7th terrorist attack, saying that SJP and other organizations essentially are, aiding and abetting the Gaza terrorists and are backed by Hamas. And this was, again, just the lawsuit. So what will come out from this, you asked about, legal repercussions. If the lawsuit makes it past the motion to dismiss stage and proceeds, you will have discovery, which means that more information will come out about what these groups have been doing, namely probably Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, how they've been funded. One example that they point to in the lawsuit is the fact that the SJP at Columbia had been dormant for several years. And then I think it was like 3 minutes before the October 7th attack went back live. And so they're using that to show that there's maybe a link between the terrorist attack and these student groups. So that's a pretty big lawsuit that I would sort of keep your eyes out for and see how it proceeds. It's in the Southern District of New York. So that's one way we're seeing it play out. And then, another just maybe not like in the court system, but just in terms of what's happening on campus is, as Carrie mentioned, there's a lot more extremism coming out of some of these students and some of these groups. And schools are doing a better job sort of cracking down on this. There actually have been more direct threats, and not just general calls against groups, as I noted in my first example. And so we're seeing that play out like at a more micro level at universities.
For explaining that and bringing that lawsuit to our attention, because you said that just came out last week. So
Yeah, it
that's
was
very
March
interesting.
26th or 27th, so very recent.
Okay. Very interesting. Sort of on a preventative note, I'd like to ask you, Ariel, continuing our discussions, our legal discussions, how important is education about the First Amendment rights and hate speech laws for both students and university staff in preventing extremism? How important is that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think there's a sense from anyone who wants to use free speech rights. Right now it's people on the far left, but it's really any group. They sort of bend it to their will, right? They interpret it as they want. And so people who want to say what they want become free speech absolutists and say you can say whatever you want whenever you want to. That's not really true. We do in America have very, very permissive free speech laws, as I noted in the first point. That doesn't mean that you can't have time, place, and manner regulations. That doesn't mean as long as it's content neutral, meaning I can't punish someone for what they're and viewpoint neutral. I can't punish someone for what they're saying. But I can't restrict someone from what they're saying, not even punish. I can't restrict them, but I can put certain, parameters on everyone. So if I say that like no one can speak in this area from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m., that's likely okay. And that means you don't have free speech wherever you want. Again, there have to be like certain, I'm not going into so many details here, but there have to be, compelling interests and like certain tests, because again, we do have really broad free speech rights, but that doesn't mean it's absolute. So that's something to note, is that as long as universities are consistent and clear about their expectations and applying it in a neutral way and the same way across the board, that is generally an okay thing to do. I do want to caveat that and note, and I think I'm being clear in saying this, that there's still certain things that need to be allowed. A university, especially a public one, can't say like no one can speak on the quad ever. But again, that does mean there's like certain areas to play with in there. So I think just to sort of tie this up neatly, universities need to do a better job of proactively sharing out their codes of conduct, their anti-harassment and discrimination policies, and everything to students, so that students are like very aware and very clear on what is required of them.
Great. Thank you very much for explaining that. And I had one more question for y'all before we turn it over to our audience, because we want this to be interactive as well and make sure our audience members get their questions addressed. As we mentioned, this is a very important and timely discussion. This question could either be for Carrie or Mark. Beyond law enforcement, what are some alternative conflict resolution strategies that could be explored by universities? And what else could be done besides just reporting incidents? I don't know. Carrie, you'd like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% want to echo what Ariel just said, because the clear messaging ahead of time is the best way, in my opinion, to avoid conflict. But like making sure, I know there's some universities where they will meet with the student groups ahead of time and they will tell them, okay, you put in a request to have a event on the quad at this time or whatever. Here are the parameters around your event. Here are the things you can and cannot do. That message is given to both groups, whoever they are, whoever is applying to have this event. That message is also given to campus safety and local law enforcement. Here are the very clear parameters around this event. If you cross the line on whatever, if you do whatever we're saying is not allowed to be done, whether, it's language, whether, whatever that is, then here are the actual consequences. And so they're given, like, I say it again, parameters on what they can and can't do. And they're told, here are the consequences if you don't follow these rules. And then law enforcement is also given those clear guidance, because sometimes, like last year, our campus safety and local law enforcement, they weren't always given the green light to enforce what was, what the code of conducts were, or to enforce, what they normally would be able to on college campuses by administrators. And now that has changed and shifted a bit. And so the campuses where I've seen the messaging be very, very clear on whatever the events are, they have been, I'll just use the term, as peaceful as possible. Both sides were able to express their feelings. It was in a controlled environment. It was during a set time and place, and it ended during that time. It's when those clear lines aren't drawn that we see the spillover into, things happening that shouldn't be happening on campuses. So I don't know if Mark wants to chime in, but that's just what I've seen work effectively versus not.
Carrie, I agree. You're right on point. I was actually on a campus that made national news. I visited a Chabad this past Tuesday, and there has been a shift, exactly what Carrie talked about, right? The ability, and we're using the terminology, both sides, right? Somebody with an opinion, the ability to communicate, gather, right, peacefully, has kind of it's transitioned into the semester. This campus that I'm talking about, it went from an action, expression of speech, to a criminal act that resulted in pretty serious charges, and then a whole debate as to whether the focus of that criminal act was hate crime activity. The bar in New York State, and as you know from your federal experience, the bar for a federal hate crime is pretty high. So early on, I worked with the leadership of the public safety entity, talking about early messaging, right? And how you're proceeding with this investigation. And, throughout the investigation, the messaging changed, the perception, and in particular, we're talking about Jewish students. And what I heard as it went on, the message was being received better than maybe earlier on in the incident. And as recent as last Tuesday, that campus is viewed as being proactive, right? Jennifer, you talked about, is it because of the current administration? I believe that's part of it. Also, the pushback from some major donors and the perception of tolerance and tolerance of anti-Semitic behavior, that has shifted. But as far as the defined policy and the willingness to enforce it has led to a safer campus.
Great. Thank you for your input on that, Mark, and addressing that. I think if there's nothing else, I'd like to turn it over to our audience members. I know there's a lot of questions kind of popping in. There's one. Ariel, would you like to take that one that has just popped up?
Yeah, I'm happy to if we want to start with Jesse's, and then I can do Cynthia's, and I'm gonna mispronounce that last name. I'm sorry, but we can do it in that order.
Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and take those. If you
Sure.
please.
Yeah, so the question is, do you have any concerns over an increased backlash against Jewish Israeli students or citizens due to regulations that may be perceived as targeting pro-Palestinian views while allowing other views? A radicalism grows in regulated spaces concern. Yes, I think that's a great question. Yes, I do have concerns. I think anyone following this would have concerns. And I'll expand on the question a bit more and what I'm seeing as well and what I'm worried we'll continue to see. Trump in January 29th issued his executive order on combating anti-Semitism, and then on February 3rd, a few days later, came out with the Anti-Semitism Task Force on several federal agencies. And there's been a ton of action since then, which I'll address in another question that came up. Within that note, there was within that time period, there was a Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Education on February 14th. Dear Colleague letters generally show us like the direction of the administration, how they're going to interpret certain things. And this Dear Colleague letter on February 14th essentially interpreted a Supreme Court case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. The case said, racial preferences can't be used in an admissions process. And this Dear Colleague letter said, we're interpreting this to mean that racial preferences can't be used at all in the college process, and listed like 15 examples, meaning you can't have certain activities that only allow certain racial groups. Because of the timing of when that happened, and because of the way that the Trump administration is removing federal funds from schools, there is a real worry and concern. And in fact, as you noted in your question, actual not even worry or concern, but probability of this happening, that there's going to be a conflation between these moves to make anti-Semitism, these actions to get rid of anti-Semitism, and these other actions to get rid of DEI on campus or other things. And then the concern is that, the Jews are getting rid of DEI, the Jews are against diversity, the Jews are against trans people, right? Trump said he was looking at federal cuts, I think it was Penn, because they allowed a trans athlete to participate in something. And it's very easy to sort of make that conflation with, oh, he's getting rid of funding cuts at other schools because of anti-Semitism. So something I want to note in that is, however you feel politically about what Trump is doing about anything, anti-Semitism is a real issue on our campuses. And I think that's sort of the bottom line throughout. You can be very against what Trump is doing regarding the deportations, again, regarding the withholding of federal funds, even regarding what he's doing to address anti-Semitism, whatever you think about his policies. But I just want to be clear that even if you're against what he's doing and think he's taking it too far, that doesn't mean that Jews are not being mistreated on campus, and that there aren't real concerns and real corrections that need to be made for them. And so, of course, the concern is, the baby's going to be thrown out with the bathwater, or whatever analogy you want to use. And so I want to sort of come back to that piece. And it's really easy for people to make these simplistic binaries as they do and have like, well, Trump's doing all of this, including these things for Jewish students, and that must mean that, none of this is bad. And so I just want to make sure we sort of return to that piece and that messaging that things can be complicated and nuanced. And, this is maybe one example of that.
Thank you for addressing that. As I'm reviewing the other questions that are coming in, there's a lot coming in, trying to keep up with them all.
Yeah.
Did you want to address?
Yeah, let me take the Department of Education one quickly, and then we can move on. So the question is, will the shutdown of the Department of Education impact Title VI actions to ensure the protection of students? And that's a great question. And and something I'll note, the Department of Education, so on sometime in mid-March, sent out a letter to 60 universities saying they were being investigated for potentially violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act as it pertained to the treatment of Jewish students on campus. A couple days after that letter was sent out, the Department of Education announced it was implementing a reduction in force and going to lay off about half of its employees. And so there's a lot of sort of mixed messages in those two things. And also, and I'll just tie into the last point I made in the first question that was asked, the Department of Education has sort of said its Office of Civil Rights is not going to necessarily be addressing issues as it relates to sexual harassment, issues as it relates to racial issues, but is sort of going full steam ahead on anti-Semitism issues. And so there's the worry there that people will perceive that and say, why are Jews getting special treatment? Again, Jews didn't necessarily ask for that. Like, we want to be treated the same as everyone else. We want to ensure that like Jewish students are being taken care of and addressed. That doesn't mean that people necessarily were okay with these other policies. So that's the first thing I want to say. Because the administration has been clear that it does take the concerns of Jewish students seriously, what some people anticipate happening, and I think the creation of the task force shows this, is that if the Department of Education does get shut down or does get reduced in force, some of these complaints and investigations will go over to the Department of Justice. And the task force includes the Department of Justice and Department of Education. So there's sort of already ways that they're working together. People have been thinking that for several months. And so I think that's sort of the indication that DOJ would take over some of these.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is a pretty good question to ask, Carrie, kind of in line of what we were talking about before, if you can address this. Are these activities on campuses student-led driven, or are you seeing more agitators from the outside leading these protests?
Yeah, great question. I'll go back in time to the encampments. You know, if you think about the rate in which those encampments took hold across the country, I think it was like an 800% increase in 48 hours. So that's not student led. You know, I love students. You know, we were all there one day, but at one point in our time, but we're not that organized. You know, kids aren't that organized. And the other piece with that, you know, there were some documents that circulated with the encampments that gave an option for every single student to have a way to participate. So even students that had zero interest in this conflict or zero interest in picking sides or taking a stance, they were given the opportunity to participate on any level. So it was a way for the bigger organizations to reach every single potential student on that campus. Meaning there were some that, you know, if you want to be all in during the encampments, you can camp for 3 days. That's the minimum requirement. You're going to miss class, etc. Or if you're not that committed and you just want to, you know, say you were a part of this, then you can be a different color and you can be a food runner. So you can do something that's less. You don't have to camp. You don't have to miss class. You can do this instead. So the organizational ability of what took hold during the encampments was much bigger than just a student-driven movement. And then if you look at a lot of the activity on campuses, even this fall, we had, you know, University of Michigan, there was during one of their fairs at the beginning of the semester, they had a die-in and most of the people arrested were not students. So are students participating? Yes, but are students driving this movement 100%? No, they aren't. Not in my opinion, not in my experience across the country. And Mark can chime in as well. He's been on several campuses and has seen similar things.
Thanks, Carrie.
Okay.
Yes. So Hillel's kind of a term that's used throughout the community, right? It's on college campuses, and there's day schools that are generally called Hillel because it's a term. And we had a fundraising event for a local day school, community school that was picked up through advertisement, social media advertisement, and targeted because the perception was it was campus affiliated with a campus. And this particular group, about 50 people, showed up. People that I am familiar with from protests throughout communities, also started to notice that they were the same individuals that I had seen on campuses, right? So it's orchestrated. it's coordinated, and a lot of it is off-campus based. There's a lot of terms that are be using agitators, whatever, but it's focused, it's coordinated, and in part of what my response to the leadership that had to respond to that is understand that these are just not student driven. You may have formal groups that are coming on your campus. So Carrie does a really good job of providing information. We are better today with the dissemination and coordination with that information. So hopefully that addressed what your question was.
And along those same lines, Mark, as far as like coordinated efforts, another thing that triggered when you said social media, and I also see this as a question from one of the audience members. When you say coordinated, they're utilizing social media, or can you speak to more about how they're doing that, or how social media and digital activism has changed the landscape for these protests? Either Mark or Carrie, whoever wants to take that on.
Carrie, why don't you address it from the threat analysis, threat background, and then I can talk about, early on, social media, and I keep using both sides of the equation. They express their desire on a number of platforms, right? Protests were advertised via Instagram, via Twitter, what have you, and then that caused, so I'll talk about one that was community based that just exploded because people were tweeting and Instagramming or whatever you call it, right? So from the threat analysis, Carrie, why don't you talk about what you do in your world and the duty desk?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it simple, but we look at all that communication online. And of course, one of the first things that I try to look at is, is this communication a direct threat, so to speak? Is this something that we need to pay closer attention to because of what the wording is or the language? I want to say the good thing about social media is it also gives us the opportunity to do some research on individuals that are maybe, or groups that are posting this information. Our duty desk that I said, mentioned earlier, the Intel Center, JSOC, it is staffed 24/7 with analysts that work around the clock. And so they are able to do a lot of research and try to understand, what is this group really trying to do? Is this a protest? Is this going to be something bigger? And so it's good and bad. The one thing I will compliment social media platforms with is a lot of the times, if it is pretty awful messaging, they are quick to take it down. Like the social media platforms are trying to regulate the way their platforms are being used. So that is getting addressed. Is it as much as we want? Of course not, but it is happening. We're seeing that they get banned from certain platforms, some of the groups like SJP, but what they do is they move to another platform. So they will move to like the dark web. They'll move to platforms where, they don't think it's going to be regulated and it isn't regulated as much, but the information is still there. So we're able to still see it and act on it if we need to and make sure our local law enforcement or federal law enforcement partners have the information. So it goes both ways. Not an easy answer.
Right.
So I can give a specific example where monitoring social media activity, picked up on an immediate threat to the Jewish community at Cornell University. And a post was made. The Secure Community Network, Duty Desk, there are some other community initiatives, one out of New York City, immediately picked up on that post that went from being an expression to an actual physical threat. And it was in my part of Western New York, Central New York. So part of the response, it was a federal response with the FBI. It was a New York State Police counterterrorism group. It was campus-based public safety in the city of Ithaca. Responded quickly, went through the measures of trying to find out where it originated from, and actually made an arrest in that case. And that was where the use of that platform is used for foreshadowing a potential action that resulted in a response and ultimately an arrest and a conviction in federal court for the activity. And I can tell you, I was on campus 2 days after that incident. The students were very much impacted by that. I attended or visited the location that was identified as the specific threat, a Jewish based dining center, and then a culmination of a gathering of students at night. And part of one of the questions talked about what type of training is offered, and Carrie can talk a little bit about the campus initiative. But this particular night, we talked about how do you counter an active threat that may get into a location that we're in. So yeah, social media is a tool that is still being utilized. And in this particular case, it helped us respond to that incident.
And the dangers are some of the social media sites are encrypted and they're, like you said, it's all coordinated efforts that they're doing together. And that's how they, I guess, can make a bigger impact by coordinating these student groups together with outside agitators. Carrie, did you want to speak any more about the training before we go on to the next question Mark alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be quick because I know we don't have a ton of time left. One thing that we did this year, at the beginning of the year, SCN, is we created a panel of students across the country to ask them, what do they need? What can we do to support them in what they are experiencing on a daily basis on campuses? And so the students' response, because SCN, we have all different types of training that we give to students and give to our community members on various topics. But this was really important to make sure that we could give the students what they wanted. And they literally said to us, we want to be able to solve our own problems. We want to be able to work through what we're experiencing. And so we asked them, what are the biggest issues that you're experiencing on college campuses? And so they gave us a lot of different situations that they've been put in. You know, I don't want to call them scenarios because they're real life experiences. And we took those events, whether it's your pathways being blocked on the way to class, whether you're inside a building and it gets taken over, how do you get out or do you try to get out? Whether it's, you know, the online harassment or, you know, you're being followed after Shabbat dinner, whatever it is, they gave us all these experiences that they've had. And we created a training around that. And so we created a training that addresses, you know, the things to do in those situations, whether it's de-escalation, situational awareness, how do you manage that situation when you're in it? And it's a very interactive training. And so we will pose the situation to the group and ask them, hey, and we show them live videos, real videos of these incidents taking place and say, if this were you, what would you do next? And so we've given them the training that they've asked for in that they can solve their own problems. They'll say, oh, I would do this or I would do that. And as law enforcement experts, we'll guide them through what we think is the best situation. You know, you're having a pro-Israel event and you're being protested. What do you do? And so that is a new training, a Safe U training that we have just pushed out and that we're starting to kind of implement and deploy on campuses across the country. But it was made basically by our students because that's what they needed and asked for.
Thank you. And so we're on the note of training, just a note from me to the audience, just we also do training as well. I encourage audience members to visit our website to look at the trainings that we do. We have our head of terrorism research that presents on Hamas in the US and campus extremism. So very informative as well. But thank you for talking about the training that SCN does. An interesting question that popped up that we've talked a lot about students and outside agitators, but I don't think we've talked about faculty. Are actions being taken regarding the involvement of faculty in many of these pro-Hamas actions that are happening on campuses? If anyone could speak to that.
Yeah, I can start and then Carrie and Mark, you can jump in. Great question. And that is actually where we're seeing, I think Carrie noted some like trends happening from last year to this year. We are seeing, and I'll note, Hillel International runs something called the Campus Antisemitism Legal Line, along with our partners at ADL, the Brandeis Center, and Gibson Dunn, a large law firm. And so a reporter can, it's called Legal Line, it's a misnomer, it's a website, but a reporter can submit an incident report. And we have attorneys, we meet twice a week and sort of evaluate these claims and see if legal action needs to be taken. So I'm sort of seeing these trends also. This line opened in November 2023, this website. we're seeing a lot move from outside protests to inside the classroom, and a lot more complaints related to faculty misconduct, faculty sort of abusing what, again, they think is academic freedom is likely not. A dance teacher cannot say, I'm going to have class in the encampment. It has nothing to do with the dance class. Or say, I'm going to offer extra credit for going to protests. It's not related to the subject matter. So we're seeing a lot of that. And there's embedded in universities already a lot of tension between faculty and administrators that's like not as easy as the student question. So that's just sort of the context for that question. Yeah, because we're seeing a lot of it, we are sort of working on incident reports that come through the faculty, and working through sort of like the legal chains on that as well. And we have seen some actions taken at some schools. A professor at Muhlenberg University, a tenured professor, was fired actually for harassing Zionist students. And so, there are actions that schools are taking against their faculty members, and hopefully we'll continue to see it being taken against faculty members that are harassing, any student for their identity.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more. Does anybody on the panel see one that they would like to address, given the last few minutes that we have before we close up and wrap up? Let's see.
There's a couple questions about like university policies, so I can sort of try to take all of those at once, if that sounds good.
That'd be great.
And yeah, and this will sort of tie into what Carrie and Mark and I have said already about universities creating policies, holding students accountable, reducing outside instigation of events. There's ways they can sort of do all those things. So one thing is some universities are requiring students to carry their student ID on them. So that's like an easy way to reduce outside instigators or agitators, right? If they're not a student, they won't have a student ID. Again, we mentioned time, place, and manner regulations. Some universities are not allowing masks because a lot of students are covering their faces. So again, this like ability to identify. The crux of everything, though, comes down to enforcement, and if universities are going to enforce these policies. Because the reality is a lot of universities have or had these policies in place, and then all of a sudden when I was going to use a maybe not so favorable analogy, but when things sort of got real with the encampments, they found themselves paralyzed and was just sort of hoping it would go away. The schools that did the best are the ones that addressed it immediately. So WashU is a great example. WashU had an encampment that was disbanded in less than 24 hours, probably 12 hours. And the president came out with a statement very forcefully explaining why it was not allowed, why it would not happen on WashU's campus. And probably none of you heard of the encampment because it was barely up. So WashU is a great example. University of Connecticut is another good example. And I know both of those because it's a private and a public school. So public schools can also take actions against it. And so I think enforcing early and often and consistently is really, really key. Not only because it helps me, not only because it's helpful for our Jewish students, but it's helpful for all students. If students don't know what rules are going to be enforced, it's really confusing for them, and they're going to continue pushing boundaries. And to be honest, I say this as a former teacher, it's sort of unfair to like inconsistently enforce rules. And again, it's really confusing. And so if universities are very clear in what they're going to enforce and do it consistently, that's really helpful for the students because then they know if I cross this line, this consequence will happen. It's a natural result of it, right? They don't feel like they're being targeted, or they might still feel that way. But again, if everything is very consistent and clear, that is fair for all involved. And that really creates a sense of safety for everyone on campus because then all students know if a law is broken or if a rule is broken, there are consequences. And imagine going to school where now there's no enforcement, and that creates a culture of chaos and a ton of uncertainty and fear for everyone. So I think that is sort of what I want to make clear is you can have the policies and you want to make sure you're enforcing them as well.
Thank you very much for wrapping that up in perfect.
I think Carrie wanted to.
Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
I just want to put one final bow on it from a law enforcement perspective. When it's gray, it makes it easy to turn against law enforcement as well. And it makes it very unsafe for our law enforcement partners on campuses to try to enforce what they know they should be enforcing. And we have seen that trend also where law enforcement is getting targeted at the same time, so I mean, Ariel, you did an amazing job of summarizing everything, but also adding in, don't forget law enforcement because the gray area puts them at risk as well.
That's an excellent point. I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of people do not think about that, and that's a good reminder. We're at our hour mark, and like I said, I know this was a very important discussion, and I really am thankful and grateful to our three panelists. I think what's clear is that meaningful progress requires collaboration between our universities, law enforcement, our legal experts, and community partners. And we really have to work together to make sure we ensure the campuses remain spaces where all students can feel safe and respected and heard. So we appreciate everyone's time and engagement on this important dialogue, and hopefully it continues beyond today. I hope everyone has a great day and stays safe out there. And thank you again. Thank you to the audience for their great questions as well. Take care.
Everyone.